It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Dame Alison Richard. Thank you for being with us here today. Alison received her undergraduate degree in anthropology at Cambridge University and her doctorate from London University. In 1972, she joined the faculty of Yale University, where she became professor of anthropology in 1986, chairing the Department of Anthropology from 1986 to 1990, and later serving as the director of the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. From 1994 to 2002, Alison served as provost of Yale. 2003 to 2010, Alison was the vice chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Your achievements received recognition in 2010 when Alison was awarded the DBE Dame Commander of the British Empire for her services to higher education. As a researcher, Professor Richard is widely known for her work and writings on the evolution of complex social systems among primates. This work has taken her to Central America, northern Pakistan, and in particular to the forests of Madagascar. Professor Richard has been working in Madagascar since 1970, when she spent 18 months studying the sociology of Sifaka, Propithecus verruxioi, for her PhD. Since 1984, in collaboration with colleagues in Madagascar and the US, her research has focused on the demography and social behavior of the Sifaka population at Bezamahafali in Madagascar. In 1975, with colleagues from the University of Antananarivo and Washington University, she launched the Bezamahafali Partnership for Conservation, Research and Training, and she has been deeply involved in that activity ever since. And in 2005, Alison was appointed Officier de l'Ordre National in Madagascar. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today, Alison.
So the first thing I just would like to say is that it's a tremendous honor and a pleasure to be speaking to you all. I admire what you do so much. I think you're wonderful. And that general point leads me to a second general point, which is although my daughter, Charlotte, is already spoken for professionally, my granddaughter, Alice, is not yet spoken for professionally, and I hope is a future recruit to your ranks, because it would be a very fine future. So this is not a book talk, but I wanted to just sort of start by saying that I published this book last year, and it was my goal to write a book that would be of interest to general readers. I've always written for fellow academics whose interest one could assume, rightly or wrongly, but you can't do that with the general reader. Anyway, at some point, and so it was a journey in itself to try to write in a different way. And somewhere early in the process, my brutally wonderful editor said to me, because I thought of this book as a kind of takedown of Henri Perrier de la Bâtie, the eminent botanist, because I have objections to some of his conclusions, right? Anyway, so that's how I thought about this book. And this editor said to me at some point, she said, I don't care about some dead white Frenchman I've never heard of. I want to know about Madagascar. So anyway, so that sort of changed, and she was right. It changed the way that I thought about the book, but it didn't change my interest and curiosity as to the reason why the prevailing story of Madagascar is still the story that is, sort of the one told by most people. That story. So anyway, so what I want to talk about today, primarily, trying not to carry coals to Newcastle. I'm very sort of aware that there are a lot of coals already here. So what can I tell you? So I thought I would sort of dive into sort of the history of human presence on Madagascar and what I make of that. None of this, I should say, is my own research. This is all synthesis of other people's research, some of it yours, and some of it people that you will know, and I will try to reference them along the way. But James Hansford's work, there are many other people that are here. So, but just to sort of to dive in then to the story side of this before I get into the human journey, which is mostly what I want to concentrate on human impact today. Let's start with the story. So, my contention is that we are a species of storytellers. This is a NASA map of climate change. The data for this have been largely established, over 40 years ago. I mean, the reality of climate change has been with us. And if you leave aside the climate change deniers, you have a body of evidence that has been refined over the years. However, if you are John Gray, the British philosopher, you look at this and your interpretation is that we are doomed, we have destruction in our DNA, and the game is up. If you are John Brown, the former chief executive of BP, you say, well, with technology and innovation and all of the brains that humans can bring to bear, we can engineer our way out of this disaster. Then if you're me, you say, well, despair is not an option, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think technology is going to get us out of this. But if we get a bit smarter, then work a bit harder, maybe there's a glimmer of hope in there somewhere. My point here is that with essentially the same basis of information that we all accept, our interpretations of it are entirely different. Turn to Madagascar. Over the last 40 years, unlike the climate change data, what we know and understand about Madagascar's past has been utterly transformed. However, the story has not changed one iota. The story has been told for a century. And the story goes like this. Madagascar was entirely covered by forest and a tropical paradise until the, choose your adjective, wicked, destructive, stupid Malagasy people arrived and they cut it all down and burned it all down. And now 90% of the original forest that covered Madagascar has disappeared. What we know today is that Madagascar has never been covered entirely by forest. There is a diversity of landscapes, including grasslands of great antiquity. And I will not rehearse our knowledge, how it is that we know about the antiquity of grasslands, because that information is largely produced by people who are here today and who are members of the Q community. So in contrast to the first example I gave you, where the same evidence produces very different stories about that evidence, in the case of Madagascar, a dramatically changing body of evidence over 40 years has not penetrated the story that is told about Madagascar. It is a story of timelessness punctuated by the arrival of people and catastrophe. Now, I cannot emphasize too strongly, this isn't just or only a story told by the National Geographic magazine or on BBC programs or in newspapers, though it is all of that. Some of you may have seen a really chilling article by Bill McConnell and Christian Cull, published in 2014, who looked at this 90% figure that 90% of Madagascar's original, whenever original forest had been destroyed. And they looked at people who had used that in academic publications, academic journal articles, and they came up with 27 articles between 1982 and 2013, where serious academics had parroted out this number. And this number is a completely fictional percentage that was published by Perrier de la Bâtie in 1921, well before there being aerial photography, well before there being satellite images. And in fact, now that I've read all of Perrier de la Bâtie's work, and actually he gives different percentages. His numbers vary between 70% and 90% between 1921 and 1934. It was just a rhetorical number that reflected his belief in what had happened, but it became sort of incorporated into the academic sort of system of facts and story about Madagascar. So sort of enough about, I want to return at the end to why it matters, I believe, to blow this story up. There are really compelling and compelling reasons to say that it is flawed at best and plain wrong at worst from a scientific point of view, and that is enough to want to overturn it once and for all. But there are reasons that go way beyond that, in my view, and which have to do with the future and with hope for the future and with some of the work that Q is now doing through the DEFRA initiative in Madagascar. So on to the human journey. Okay, so when did people first? So I want to do this in 4 pieces. Sort of, what does the archaeological record tell us about sort of the human footprint in Madagascar? Where did these people come from? Their roots. What did they do when they came to Madagascar? And then finally, what was their impact? So, what does the archaeological record tell us? Well, the first possible trace of people in Madagascar is 10,000 years old. We know that from very secure dating of these bones of giant elephant. I believe that James Hansford lectured here a few weeks back, and you may have heard that lecture. So these marks on these bones were recognized by James. These bones came from one of the giant flightless birds. They were discovered in southwest Madagascar, 2 leg bones. As I say, the dating is secure, I think, as far, insofar as radiocarbon dating is secure, and I think it is. 10,000, these are 10,000-year-old bones. What is less secure is whether these are actually chop marks made by stone tools wielded by people. There was a paper published that claims that. I have a very high regard for James Hansford, and he is convinced, and I know him well, he is convinced that they are correct in their diagnosis of these as made by human tools. But I have a colleague at Yale who is working on hominid stone tool use, and for whom I also have enormous respect. She is skeptical. Anyway, and I think it's the nature of the beast. That is, how do you really know whether these are human-made marks or not? It's hard to decide that, and more work is needed on that. But me, myself, and I'm inclined to go with Hansford's conclusion and the paper that's been published on this, and say that this to me is a trace, a faint trace, 10,000 years ago, of people in Madagascar. It seems entirely plausible to me. So let us accept that. But then there's nothing until you get to 6,000 years ago, and then you get another couple of bones picked up. Again, Apiornis, elephant bird bones, and again, a few chop marks. But it's a faint, indirect trace of human presence. Where you first get really strong evidence, clear evidence of people in Madagascar is 4,000 years ago at a rock shelter way up on the northern tip of Madagascar in the Montagne des Françaises. And I was giving Alex a hard time this morning because he did not include this paper in the wonderful article that he wrote, that he and a cast of 184 published in Science magazine recently. And I should, in the interest of full disclosure, part of the reason that I was giving him a hard time is that my late husband, Robert Dewar, was the archaeologist who led this excavation. So this is Bob's work. And so anyway, the reason that Alex excluded it is because very reasonably he was using a paper by another archaeologist who had verified all of the radiocarbon dates for archaeological sites in Madagascar, and that takes you back 2,000 years. But this was not radiocarbon dated, it was dated using optically stimulated luminescence, which is a different technique, and the paper by Douglas et al. Didn't cover that, and so she didn't mention it, though she knows it full well. Anyway, no matter. 4,000 years ago, in this rock shelter, there were people using microlith stone tools. There is one skull of a now extinct giant lemur. There are random pieces of pottery. There's lots of seashells. People, it was a foraging camp, a hunting camp. There is nothing else like it. It's the only one that's been discovered in Madagascar. People, the stone tools that they were using came from sources of quartz 100 kilometers from this site, but in Madagascar. I mean, these are Malagasy sites. So these people were roaming widely. We'll come back to where they came from and how they got there and whether it was by accident. But that takes you back 4,000 years. Then there is a site on the west coast that takes you back 2,000 years to the sort of the beginning of the Common Era. But if you come all the way forward to 1200 AD, and you look here, the archaeological sites are squares. The habitation, the human presence in Madagascar was still, on the coasts, and there are undoubtedly more settlement sites to be found. These are small hamlets and villages. It was a minimal population. There is no evidence of anybody in the Central Highlands at that time. And it is sort of interesting and paradoxical that some of the most intact habitat in Madagascar is in the very areas where peoples have been longest present. Return to that. But this is what the human presence in Madagascar looks like by around 1200 AD. But there is sort of round about that time, the population had clearly been growing slowly. There is a step function. And in the 12th century, you see the development of the first major port on the northwest coast of Madagascar. And it wasn't just a port, it was also a town in which you see the first evidence of social hierarchy. There are big houses and small houses. There is a wall around this city. People were bringing quartz, they were bringing gold, they were bringing silver to this place for export, and goods were being imported. So this was a sort of evidence of a major trading hub in Madagascar. It was there from the 12th to the 14th century AD. There was nothing else like it. Then it disappeared for reasons that nobody understands. And other ports opened up in other parts of the coastal surroundings, particularly in the northeast. This is also the time that you start to see the settlement of the Central Highlands. 12th century AD, it's quite quite recent that people moved into the interior. And from the 12th century on, you see the development of sort of small chiefdoms all over the island. By the 16th century, you're moving out of the archaeological record and you're getting historical accounts of the first European visitors who remarked upon these chiefdoms that all over the island and that were constantly warring with each other. You come to the early 18th century, and one chiefdom in the Central Highlands, the Amerina, the Kingdom of the Amerina, grew, prospered, and conquered much of the island. And that is the point at which the state of Madagascar was established as sort of as a nation, if you will, by the late 18th century. It is quite phenomenal to me that Madagascar had compulsory primary education before the UK did. Think about that. And the first US consul anywhere in Africa was to Madagascar. And the Malagasy government played off the British against the French for the best part of 200 years. The London Missionary Society was very active in Madagascar, and Malagasy was at that point not a written language. And they wanted to write the language down so that they could have a written translation of the Bible in Malagasy. And so they went to the Queen and asked for permission to produce a written version of the Malagasy language. And her response was, yes, that is fine, as long as you use French vowels and British consonants. So if you want to know how to pronounce the Malagasy language, as long as you can speak French and English, you can pronounce it. But this was kind of sort of a wonderful act of diplomacy. This queen, it should be said, so the state was run by queens, because you could always tell who was really the daughter if it was the mother who was giving birth. The queens married their prime ministers. And so that was how the men sort of also came to rule. It was a very sort of interesting and complicated way of going about things. And the early queens welcomed the London Missionary Society. Some of their daughters and granddaughters threw the missionaries off the cliffs. So it was not altogether sort of a happy circumstance. In 1896, however, in the 1890s, the French and the British finally went behind the backs of the Malagasy, and it was agreed that Britain would get Mauritius and France would get Madagascar. And, in the way that these colonial enterprises happened, sort of the French ended up taking over, declaring Madagascar a colony in 1896. And Madagascar only regained its independence in 1960. But I think it's important, I mean, this will come into my sort of account of human impact, that very sort of long period of 2 centuries of statehood, followed by the imposition of not very successful colonization in the first half of the 20th century, brings us to the Madagascar that sort of we know today, the Madagascar of post-independence in the 1960s. Okay, so that is sort of the archaeology, and beyond the archaeology into the historical evidence, and sort of brings us somewhere closer to the present. But I have said that what the archaeological record doesn't tell you at all, is really silent about, is who were these people who came to Madagascar? And, we now maybe have intimations of when they came, but who were they? Where did they come from? Well, obviously they came by boat. That was the only way to get there. One would think, looking at the position of Madagascar in the globe, that Madagascar would have been populated from Africa, pretty much exclusively. If you look, and so, what does the genetic data tell us about that? And what does the linguistic data tell us about that? The genetic data tells us that 60% of the genome, the genetic profile of the Malagasy people today is African, 40% is Indonesian. So, you know, that's a substantial input of Indonesian ancestry. Interestingly, if you look at the genetic profile of Malagasy men and Malagasy women show a stronger Indonesian component than men on average. The men have a more African component. What that tells you is that the people coming from Africa were more men, and the people coming from Indonesia were more families, men and women, a bigger input of women from Indonesia. So the genetic data says it's a mix. It's unclear whether that mix happened in Madagascar or on the coast of East Africa. How did people? Okay, so that's the genetics. So what about the linguistics? What does that tell us? That is just completely amazing. The closest relative of the Malagasy language is a language called Manyan, which is spoken in Borneo, way upstream by a community living in the forests of the interior of Borneo with no seafaring history. And it is the universally spoken language of Madagascar. I mean, the world is just full of such interesting mysteries. So, and I have a notion of how that happened, but anyway, how it became a lingua franca for the whole island, which I'll come to in a minute. But so, how did people get from Indonesia to Madagascar, and why would they do that? The genetic data again say that this movement of people from Indonesia began in the 7th, 8th century. That corresponds to the beginning of the build-up of coastal settlements in Madagascar. So the genetic data and the archaeological data are both saying that around the 7th, 8th century, something was changing then. And there is good reason to believe that that was a time when Indonesians started to move west, because it was a time that there was a Malayan empire being established through Southeast Asia. It was brutal, it was imperial, and there would have been good reason to flee your homeland. Now, how would you flee? Well, for the last 4,000 years, there has been a trade network. There was, well, for 4,000 years, there was a trade network around the rim of the Indian Ocean. The monsoon system allowed you to sail your boat easily in both directions. It took 2 years to get from Madagascar, or to get from Indonesia to Madagascar and back. But you could do it because you could catch the winds in both directions. And it wasn't until the 15th century AD, CE, that people figured out how to get across the Atlantic, where the winds only blow in one direction. Once they figured that out, the Atlantic became the new center of trade, the ocean of trade. But the Indian Ocean was a whole world of trade that preceded that. And there is good reason to believe that, by 0 CE, at the beginning of the Common Era, people were coming all the way to Madagascar to trade with whoever was there and to carry off quartz in particular. Madagascar has the purest quartz anywhere in the world. It made its way up to Egypt, almost certainly, to be carved into vases. Soapstone was exported from Madagascar. There were many exports. So traders would have been coming back to Indonesia and saying, there is this place where almost far away, where almost nobody lives, and where there are great riches. And so some of the people who came to Madagascar probably came around the rim of the Indian Ocean on traders' boats. But so many came in a fairly short period of time, building the population between the 7th and 8th century, up into the 10th century, that almost certainly some of them came straight across the Indian Ocean. And there is a current, the equatorial current, that flows from east to west. And in 1985, a small group of English and French complete nutters, I would say, built a boat with not a single nail, using a Filipino sort of way of building boats from around the 8th century. So they set off on this boat across the Indian Ocean, with their only navigation being the stars and the sun. And they made it. It was called the Surimanac was the name of this boat. And they made it, and Madagascar was in sight. So they actually made it all the way across the ocean to Madagascar, and then a wind carried them north, and they ended up being towed into the Comoro Islands by the French Navy, who then towed them to Madagascar. So you could get all the way across the ocean and still miss Madagascar. But anyway, so the genetic evidence sort of says it's a mix. The linguistic evidence says that the language, I mean, the language is unequivocally an Indonesian language. There are other lines of evidence, and I put this in because I thought you botanists, if you don't already know it, that you would like it. The crops, I mean, this is a stunning kind of piece of botanical evidence by Alison Crowther, showing that for the Comoro Islands and Madagascar, insofar as we know it, the crops that were introduced and grown are Asian crops, whereas on the African coastline, they are crops of African origin. So there is this very sort of curious and interesting and historically contingent kind of meeting of people in Madagascar. But very interestingly, if you ask Malagasy people today where they are from, they say from Madagascar. Our ancestors are here. There is no sense of them being an immigrant people. Nobody thinks of themselves that way. How does that happen? And when does it happen? Anyway, it's an anthropological question, I think. So that's the history of their coming. So what did these people do when they came? Well, that's, they fished a lot. I mean, you saw they're all coastal communities in the early years. And there's plenty of evidence in the archaeological record in these little settlements of fishing gear, hooks, weights, the stuff that you expect to find with fishermen. By the 10th century, cattle had been introduced, initially European cattle, but then Asian cattle that withstand zebu, cattle that withstand heat better. And various forms of farming. By the 12th century, there is irrigated rice farming, as well as dry hill farming, and then a variety of crops. As ever, the diversity of environments mean that you need a diversity of survival strategies. But along with growing things and animal husbandry, there is a very long history of trade and evidence of trade within Madagascar. You pick that up by seeing pottery styles that move around the island. You pick it up from the ancient port, the port of Mahilika up in the northwest, with these big piles of crystal quartz chips left over. So there is, and I put, this slide contains sort of makes 3 points. In the top right, what you see there are women today, I took that photograph, women who have have produced salt from the soil. It's called siratani, salt of the earth. And they produce this in the southwest from salty soils. And it is then, they take it to market, and it's highly appreciated in Madagascar. It has a low sodium and high potassium, relatively low sodium and high potassium content, and it tastes quite different. And if you have hypertension, and there's a lot of hypertension in Madagascar, Siratani is what you want to use to salt your food. Anyway, they take this to the local market, and it gets traded through the informal sector, and has done. This has been the case for centuries. So there is an internal domestic market. Then if you look down at the bottom right, that is taken a few years ago by a friend who exported quartz from Madagascar. And that is a modern photo of an enormous piece of quartz being taken to the coast for export. And that trade goes back certainly to the 11th, 12th century. And as I say, probably earlier. And then on the left, you will recognize vanilla. So you've got international trade for export. You've got domestic trade. These are ancient activities. Then you've got vanilla, which is now one of Madagascar's biggest exports, from a plant that was introduced in the 18th century. So it's a sort of, it's a new dimension of trade in this island. And sort of the meta message here is sort of there's this whole notion of Madagascar as a stable, unchanging place followed by disaster. What I see in the record of human activity is a changing place, changing activities, changing priorities, new opportunities, and vanilla is one of them. If you tell a vanilla farmer today that vanilla is not native to Madagascar, he will look at you as if you need your head examined, because it has been completely incorporated into the culture. But my point, how am I doing? My point here is that when you think about trade, you need to be able to communicate with people. And I believe that the reason that Madagascar has one language, the Malagasy language, Borneo, as you will know, has 84 different mutually incomprehensible versions of Indonesian languages. How is it that Madagascar has one, and probably had one by around the 17th century, from what the sort of visitors tell us? And I think that it's trade, that these were a people of traders. They came with traders in large measure. They traded when they arrive. And if you trade, you have to have a lingua franca, even if you don't all speak the same language. And that the Malagasy language that came to predominate is a language of trade. And that is an important sort of piece of understanding the history of what was going on there. Okay, so human impact. We have established, it is well established that Madagascar had grasslands dating back 4 to 7 million years. You have established that. It is unclear how extensive those grasslands were. Undoubtedly, they have increased. I don't want to be a sort of, I'm not a Pollyanna. I mean, of course, human impact has been substantial, but how substantial is unclear. And until we have a clearer picture of what was going on in Madagascar over the last 2,000 years, from a paleoecological point of view, there will be many questions about this. So forest was clearly being cleared by people for farming. Of that, there is no question. I put this, we don't know how much, going back 2,000 years. I put this slide in and that's actually really all I want to say about this. I put this slide in for one reason, because I think it carries, for me, a really important message. This comes from stalagmites that have been analyzed by Laurie Godfrey and Burns, and this paper is by Peterson Feiner, is the senior author. They've looked at stalactites in caves in the northwest and the southwest, and it's a fabulous piece of new technology, looking at tracking oxygen isotopes doing oxygen isotope analysis and carbon isotope analysis through time by taking slices through these stalactites, stalagmites, not the ones that build up. And what that enables you to do is to keep to track independently climate and sort of an indicator of C3, C4 of vegetation, broad indicators. Okay, what this slide is of is the carbon signal from stalagmites in the northwest, that's the blue line, and in the southwest. And I didn't want to show you multiple slides, but what this slide shows is that in the northwest, if you look at the oxygen isotope, there is no change at that point around 1,000 years ago. But the carbon isotope takes a nosedive, and that is corresponds to the time that people are appearing in the northwest and clearing forest, and you've got more C4 species appearing there. It is just there is a dramatic separation of the lines. If you go back through time and you track the carbon and the oxygen isotopic data, they track one another really, they follow one another beautifully. And then you get to this point 1,000 years ago, and the carbon isotope line just falls away precipitously. It is the most, to me, it's the clearest and most dramatic indicator of human impact and forest clearance in this place in the northwest of the island. Come down to the southwest, where you saw that map. There were people there, far into the past. It's where the earliest settlements are found. But there is no such giant shift in the carbon isotope ratios, and in fact, they continue to track the oxygen isotope ratios. What that says is that in the Southwest, whatever people were doing, they were doing something different, and it wasn't having this transformational impact on their surroundings. And that in the Southwest, the vegetation was pretty much tracking onto climate trends. And there were periods of aridification in all of this and long droughts. And there's a very, very fine-tuned tracking of the one with the other. What I would say to you, and it makes this whole sort of reconstruction of human impact on Madagascar sort of doubly problematic, because there isn't a single story. The island is continent-like in its diversity of climates and vegetation, and that, for a start, has different sort of opens up different vulnerabilities from the point of view of what's going to happen to the vegetation. And secondly, it meant that people were doing different things. And in the Southwest, they were evidently not clearing land for forest. Almost certainly they were fishing, because there was wonderful coasts and wonderful fishing. And why bother going inland if you could make your living very well fishing? So anyway, my point is that the stories need to be regional stories for human impact on this island. So that is one point. And the second is that, that slide I just showed you is what happened, in the 7th, 8th, 9th century. And the story of Madagascar is a story of the arrival of the stupid, ignorant, destructive Malagasy people who destroy everything. But actually, if you come up to the colonial period, by contemporaneous estimates at the time, between 3 and 7 million hectares of forest were cleared between 1900 and 1940. And there was a substantial export trade established of cattle to other islands in the West Indian Ocean. Those cattle were held in huge holding areas in the Central Highlands and in the Eastern rainforests at a level of concentration and trampling that there was extensive forest clearance that just happened as a consequence of overgrazing, overbrowsing, and trampling by cattle. So I just sort of, again, I think that there is so much focus on what happened when people first arrived in Madagascar. There is a completely insufficient focus on colonial exploitation, which was the export of wood, the export of cattle, the expansion of agriculture, the removal of Malagasy people from the most fertile valley bottoms up onto the hillsides where ridden agriculture is unsustainable because the slopes are too steep. So the history is a complicated history. So that is all vegetation. But very quickly, I'm sorry. So what about the extinctions of the fauna then? Okay, so you've got this giant megafauna. So was it the vegetation? Was it the destruction of forest that took them out? That probably had some impact on them for sure. But what about people? Was it people who hunted them out? I put this slide in before. Now I'm showing it to you again. Look at the archaeological sites that have subfossils in them. Almost none, 3. It is a really curious feature. In these early archaeological settlement sites, in their middens, in their rubbish pits, you would expect to find, would you not, the bones of subfossils, of these extinct subfossils, if they were being hunted to extinction for food. And you just don't find them there. The subfossil sites are not in human occupation sites. They're in big sinkholes in limestone. They are paleontological sites. They're not archaeological sites. Finding any sort of human activity in relation to in proximity and association with subfossils is very rare. So that is, I still find that puzzling. I still find that puzzling. So why did they go extinct? Because there is no question that these subfossil species, 17 species of lemurs, the megafauna of Madagascar went extinct between the 7th century and the 16th century. So what on earth happened? Well, people, whatever they were doing, people weren't bringing this stuff, these animals back to home to eat them. Maybe they were eating them out in the forest. But anyway, I puzzled about this a lot. And then I found this amazing paper by Alroy. So the story of this graph, this is in Science, published in 2001. He did a simulation model of 41 herbivores in the United States and North America. Of those 41 species of herbivores, 30 went extinct, are now extinct, and 11 are not. And so he modeled with varying parameters, trying to predict what would drive these animals to extinction. And the black line is the human population increasing. The light gray lines are all of the species that went extinct. And the thin black line are the species that survived. And he ran multiple trials varying his parameters. And what came out of this, which was just kind of completely sort of, to me, it had all kinds of relevance to Madagascar. The record is much fuller for North America. You couldn't do this for Madagascar at the moment. But what he found is that at relatively low, though increasing human population densities, making a range of differing assumptions about herbivore densities and so forth, even the most incompetent hunters, if you hunt from time to time and occasionally bring down animals, in 1500 years, you drive them to extinction. What his modeling suggested was that once you get humans with any level of hunting and any level of population density, you will drive these animals, most species, many species, to extinction, and particularly the large-bodied species. And to me, I found this very helpful because there is no evidence of a slaughter, none in Madagascar, and yet the megafauna went extinct. So I think that the answer has to be opportunistic hunting, but a low level of hunting with large-bodied animals with a low population density. You take them to a tipping point where they can't find mates, and there is regional climate change, and there is some habitat loss, and you put all of that together, and you end up with the extinct megafauna. So anyway, why, so we have a more complicated and nuanced history of Madagascar. Why does the story of the instantaneous destruction of Madagascar's forests by the arrival of people persist? I think it's very simple. I think it's because it's one of the most powerful stories of the Western world and beyond for the last 3,000 years. And that is the story of sort of the destruction of paradise and paradise lost. And that it predates the Christian and Judaic tradition. It has very deep roots. And it is a story that we've been telling ourselves, theologians have told ourselves, the search for paradise on earth. I like this map. This was a 1492 map. Right in the middle of it, you see St. Brendan's Island. That did not exist. That was a mythical island and was one of the seats of earthly paradise. And the cartographers were still putting these mythical places where earthly paradise existed into 1492. And that tradition continues to the present. The National Geographic, labels Madagascar as paradise, lost paradise, destroyed paradise. Paradise crops up a lot. So I think that one piece of the power of this story is that it is part of our it's part of our deep cultural heritage. But another piece of the story is that it suited the colonists very well to have a story of destruction of something precious, because it justified the expropriation of that something precious so that it could be exploited themselves. I mean, it is a story that colonists have used in many places in the world. It is stuck more in Madagascar than elsewhere. I would go a step further and say that actually it's also a story that suits the rhetoric of conservation, that Madagascar was a paradise and it's been largely destroyed, and now we conservationists have to stand up and save it. So, I worry that a simple, powerful story is still being used where it should not be. So to end, these are the animals I study, which probably I should have given this talk about, but I didn't. Anyway, I had to show them to you once. But to end where I began, why does any of what I've been going on about really matter? And to me, well, it matters because the science is telling us something very different from the story that is told, and the science should prevail and more science be done. So that's one reason for it, and it's important. But for me, who am very involved in conservation as well as science at Madagascar, it matters because the story that we're told is a story of blame. It's a blame game. It's blaming the Malagasy people. And that is a lousy basis for the partnership that is necessary, essential, if there is to be hope for the future of Madagascar's natural resources and its people. It's going to come through partnership, international partnerships. I mean, the same is true the world over. And a blame game story is a terrible basis on which to establish a partnership. And so for me, trying to transform the way in which not just we think about Madagascar. But Malagasy people themselves have taken on board this story that, you know, they've destroyed 90% of their habitat and there was never grassland before. That all needs to change. So anyway, so that's why I do what I do, kind of. So thank you very much, and I'm sorry I talked for too long. Thank you.
I'm going to add the sales pitch on behalf of
Oh,
Alison.
thank you.
This is the new book.
And it just came out in paperback yesterday, so it's cheaper now.